Kia ora koutou. Welcome to the second Getting on Board webinar on putting the board to work. My name is Helen Bartle and I'm the Senior Advisor for Audience Development and Capability Building at Creative New Zealand, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce this session to coincide with the launch of the fourth and fully revised edition of the Getting on Board publication by Graham Narkis from BoardWorks International. It's great to have so many board members from a range of organisations on the call today, as well as senior managers across New Zealand, so welcome to you all. Today, Graham will be taking us through some of the practical issues involved in carrying out the work of the board, and this will include planning and managing the board's workload, conducting board meetings, and nurturing the all-important board-executive relationship. We will break after each section for questions, and you can either use the Q&A box on the right-hand side of your screen or indeed the chat box, and you can send your question to either myself or Graham or Cassandra or indeed all the participants. So you're currently on mute, as you may have gathered, but we will unmute you if you have a question, and that's really just to avoid background noise. So without further ado, I just hand you over to Graham, and really looking forward to this webinar. Hi, Graham.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us webinar this morning. As Helen said, the theme of today's webinar is putting the board to work, and as she mentioned, there are three parts to it. It takes us into some of the content of the new edition of Getting on Board, which I guess many of you have seen, and if you haven't, I suggest that it might be useful to get a copy, because there is quite a bit of revised and new material in that compared with the earlier editions. I'm going to go through each of these topics in turn, and as Helen also mentioned, I'll pause at the end of each of these to enable us to deal with any questions that may be arising from that material. The starting point really is to acknowledge that the time of the board is perhaps its greatest asset and its challenge. Boards, of course, are only part-time in the sense of their direct involvement in the organisation, and perhaps a generous estimate of the amount of time that boards spend in meeting together might be 30 to 40 hours a year. For some boards it may well be less than that. So that's the equivalent of one staff working week, and the paradox of that part-time effort is that the board is continuously accountable for total organisational performance, whether that's month by month, week by week, even minute by minute. So the board has to use its time to ensure that it can fulfil its fiduciary responsibilities for organisational performance, even on that very small amount of time. It's quite interesting when you face up to that challenge. It's really impossible to have a detailed grasp of everything that's going on in the organisation. So a critical skill for the board is to sort out those things that are important from those things that are comparatively less important. And I've always been attracted to the notion that Robert Greenleaf first described nearly, 40-odd years ago in the 1970s, when he wrote his various essays on leadership in a governance role. And he said that it's necessary for a board to practice the art of systematic neglect. And I guess if we were referring to a modern idiom, we may well translate that to say, not sweating the small stuff. And I think that's something that every board has to find its own way through. One of the ways of thinking about this is to separate out what is important from what is urgent. And that's a useful discussion for the board to have, perhaps even just using this little matrix that's on the screen now, to ask your board members to go through a little exercise, which is something we've done with a number of boards, and for them to just be asked to think about a typical board meeting and to consider how much of its total meeting time might go into each of these boxes. The problem is that things which are not important tend to crowd out those things that are important, regardless of their degree of urgency. And we found most boards that we've tried this little tool out on conclude that between 40 and 60% of their total time is down those two bottom quadrants. In other words, they waste about half of their time. So what our challenge is to get boards to think about what is really important, and the things that are important and urgent are often the reactive crisis management stuff. And again, we don't want boards to be spending too much time on that. We talked last time about things like effective policy making, which actually helps you out of that urgent and important box and gives you more time to spend on things that are important but not urgent. And there's a variety of things there that we might think about, and none of these typically have deadlines attached to them. So we've got the board's ongoing strategic thinking role, thinking about risks that face the organisation, thinking about the sort of relationships you want to have with key stakeholders, and so forth and so on. And another thing, if you think about those things that are in that top right-hand quadrant there, they are things that are all future-facing. You know, a bit of a cliche perhaps, but it's often referred to the tendency of many boards to try and steer their organisations by looking in the rear vision mirror. In other words, the bulk of their meeting time is spent poring over information and so forth, which is simply of historical relevance and not spending nearly enough time facing the future. A tool that we found of considerable assistance to many of our clients is the idea of an annual work plan or an annual agenda. And this is a way of helping the board to get into that sort of situation where they are focused on what is really an important use of their time, what are the important things that they have to do whether they want to or not, what I've called on the screen non-discretionary. And particularly to identify that the opportunities for discussion on things that are really important in terms of, say, strategic and policy issues, but which no one is forcing on them. There's no deadlines attached. No one, external agencies are not asking for those discussions. They're simply the things that go to the heart of really effective governance. So the exercise for any board is to take that 30 or 40 hours that I was talking about before, thinking of those perhaps as some form of currency and saying, how should we best spend that time? What are the things that justify the board's collective time and attention in collaboration with its senior staff? And the idea is to schedule whatever it concludes is the best use of its time into a meeting schedule for the year, so that ahead of time you can actually say, well, at our May meeting we're going to be focusing on topic X, at our August meeting we're going to be focusing on topic Y, and so forth and so on. And by doing that, that's a way of driving each board meeting's agenda and ensuring that the board is less at risk of being distracted by really low-level activities. I think we've probably all experienced this in boards that we've been involved with, and that is the tendency to run out of time. No matter what length of time is scheduled for the board meeting, there is this sort of sense that as we get closer to the scheduled finish time, we're moving faster and faster to get through the remaining items on the agenda. And that's another tendency too. We tend to overload our agendas, and we put far too much onto them and therefore really struggle. And it's very easy for the front end of the agenda to get away on us. And I say that as a relatively experienced chair and facilitator of board meetings. It's a trap that I fall into as much as anybody else does. So we want to try and avoid that 5 o'clock rush, because the tendency we all have, I think, as we get close to that time, our attention starts to wander to the next thing that we've got to move on to, and we start to self-censor. We start to say, well, nobody will thank me if I raise this question at this time of the meeting. It will just drag things out, prevent us from getting to our next meeting or getting home for dinner or taking the kids to swimming lessons or whatever it is. So that means to avoid that problem, you've got to do something about the traditional structure of your agenda. A traditional board meeting agenda dealt with a plethora of minutiae at the start of its meetings. Confirmation of the minutes of the previous meeting, matters arising, committee reports, chair's report, chief executive's report. And that's all mostly passive receipt of information. It's historical information, as I mentioned earlier on, but the discussion of it can easily blow out on you and consume a pretty elastic amount of meeting time. So we talk about the inverted agenda, turning that traditional type of agenda on its head and trying to schedule topics and sequence them through the meeting so that we're dealing with important matters before we start dealing with urgent items. But I've called it here the thinking stuff before the tick it off stuff, and there's always a bit of tick it off stuff, compliance type topics that we have to deal with. Try and deal with the decision making before the receipt of information, and what I've called the need to know before the nice to know. Now, in relation to those last two items on that slide, I think a board has also got to give serious thought to whether or not it even has those types of full information items on its agenda. Bearing in mind that very valuable currency of time that I talked about before, you actually don't need a board meeting to receive information. That information can be provided in some other way, and with the technology available to boards these days, that information can be circulated when it's ready between meetings, and people can absorb it well ahead of the next board meeting. And if there's anything substantial that arises from a full information type of material, you can ask for that to become an agenda item. Now, if we take that a stage further, we can think about also how this relates to the flow, the ebb and flow of a board meeting. There's a bit of a biorhythm, I find, to a board meeting. It often starts comparatively slowly, and it builds up a bit of a head of steam, and then no matter how long the board meeting is, it can tailor off, and that's when people's energies start running down, when their concentration starts to wane, when they're starting to turn their attention to whatever it is that they're going to be doing when the board meeting has finished. So as I've said along the top there, attendance and energy levels and focus tend to follow that green line through the course of the meeting. So it's worthwhile thinking of building the agenda around this, and that inverted agenda that I referred to takes this into account. So some form of limbering up, a bit like an athlete does before an event, is worthwhile thinking about. Some boards do this by meeting ahead of the scheduled start for a meal, or even just coffee and some finger food, or just some other way of transitioning from the previous activity that you were involved in through into the board meeting that you're going to be involved in today. And that's an important recognition also, that the board is a social organism, and the members of the board relate to each other as human beings, and they need to reconnect with each other. Depending on the frequency of your board meetings, this may be a more demanding role. So if your board meets monthly, then you see each other relatively regularly. But if your boards only meet 2 monthly or quarterly, then there's a real need for you to reconnect with each other as people. So it's what that limbering up process is about, and then you reach the start of the meeting proper. And there are some preliminaries that you need to deal with. I mentioned before that the traditional agenda starts off with dealing with the minutes and so forth. There's actually no reason why, and many of our clients now do this, that you don't deal with the minutes later in the meeting. If the minutes have been sent out in draft form shortly after the previous meeting, any problems with the record of that meeting can be dealt with offline and well ahead of the next board meeting. So the confirmation of the minutes of the previous meeting should just be a pro forma action. But there are some important preliminaries that you do need to deal with at the start of a board meeting, such as, for example, declarations of any interests or potentially conflicts of interest in relation to anything that's on the agenda. But apart from that, there's not much else that needs to be dealt with before you get into the substance of the meeting. So what we're trying to do is to schedule those really important topics, the things that come off that annual agenda or annual work plan, into the front half of the meeting, when people's attention is likely to be greater, when they're likely to be fresher, when they're likely to be less bored, shall we say, and they're there in mind as well as in presence. And then the things that can be dealt with perhaps more peremptorily, some of the wind down issues, as I've called them, compliance, receipt of reports, those can be dealt with in the latter part of the meeting. And if you do run short of time, if you do encounter that 5 o'clock rush that I referred to, then they can be taken as read, and the meeting can easily then finish on time. And most importantly, because you've dealt with the most important stuff earlier in the meeting, you can all leave the meeting with a sense of satisfaction that your time's been well spent. Now, there's one other thing that I'd just like to refer to in relation to this slide, and that's the reference down the bottom to board-only time. It's a pretty common practice across many boards in many different sectors now to spend a little bit of time at the front end of the meeting or even before the meeting starts with no staff, including the executive director or chief executive, GM, whoever, actually present. And I find that as a chair incredibly valuable time because it's a chance to talk with the board about the forthcoming meeting, to identify anything that's of concern to anyone. It gives me as a chair the opportunity to think how best to manage those so that no harm is done to the relationship between staff and management, staff and board. It gives us a chance to talk about the agenda and the priorities and think about where our focus needs to be. It's also an opportunity, if anyone's concerned about the quality of reporting or anything like that, for that to be raised without the possibility of later on, when staff are present, dumping on them because they haven't done what an individual board member expected them to do, or that type of thing. So that's the work planning and inverted agenda approach to getting on top of the board's time management. One other thing I'd just like to comment on very briefly is the need for that inverted agenda to make plenty of opportunity for what in the literature is increasingly referred to as generative thinking. And a lot of that is about sense making. It ties up with some of the things that we talked about at the last webinar, but just giving board members and staff present a chance to share their perceptions of what's happening in the operating environment, to think about different ways of framing the challenges that the board and the organisation is facing, and giving people time, relatively unrushed, to share insights and gain collectively new insights, and to reflect on progress that's being made. So I'm going to pause, Helen, at this point and see if there's any questions in relation to this material.
Thanks very much, Graham. That was fantastic, and I think there will probably be some board members out there that are recognising that it's often not as easy to put the important and thinking stuff first, but I think the inverted agenda approach is a really, really interesting and obviously well-tested one. So if anyone does have any questions or indeed observations that you'd like to raise, you can unmute your line by pressing *6. So if anyone does have anything, feel free to do so. And maybe you could just introduce who you are and which organisation you're with. Otherwise, we will continue on, but just want to give people an opportunity.
Hello, Libby Limbrick, Storylines.
Hi, Libby.
Just a quick question. I like the idea of the inverted agenda, but I just wonder about matters that arise from the minutes that are sort of, you might say, there's business in process. Should they be dealt with and sort of signed off, or are you suggesting that one should come back to those matters that arise?
Libby, I try to avoid having anything that looks like matters arising because that is the greatest potential risk to the board meeting getting out of control, because you often find yourselves ending up having the last board meeting all over again. What I prefer to do is have a really clear action list arising out of the previous board meeting, which supplements the minutes, and then expecting your chief executive or their equivalent to report against those, and that usually takes care of most of the matters arising. And if it doesn't, you can have something right at the end of the meeting that basically says, you know, is there any other business, you know, or any other questions or comments. I think you'll probably find in the normal course of events most things get picked up.
Thank you.
Thanks, Libby. Unless there is another question, I think we'll probably continue on to the second section.
Helen.
Oh, hi.
Hi, Ewan from Chamber Music New Zealand.
Hi, Ewan.
The one thing which you haven't addressed, I guess it's part of that, it could be part of the limbering up, but we include an environmental scan as a sort of something which doesn't find its way necessarily, led by the CE, that doesn't find its way necessarily into the reports that are tabled. And, you know, again, a potential area for blowing out time, but I'd be interested in Graham's take on having that sort of slightly unstructured start to the meeting, an environmental scan.
Thanks for that question, Ewan. I'm really pleased that you raised that, because that is something I like to do really right at the start of that, the board meeting proper, almost the first item. And you need to control it quite carefully, sort of limits it to about 10 minutes or quarter of an hour. And I often refer to it as a radar screen discussion. And it's a question of asking everyone, what's happened since we last met, or what are the new issues that have arisen, or what have you heard about what's going on in our operating environment that we should perhaps be aware of and perhaps seek out some further information on. And it's, as you say, it could well be considered part of that limbering up process, because it is a good way of getting people into the swing of the meeting, getting them thinking upwards and outwards, and starting that strategic thinking process. So I think it should be a regular agenda item.
Thank you.
Thanks, Graham. So I think we should move on to the next section now. Thank you. Okay, so having planned the board's work, what we're going to do now is focus a little on the conduct of board meetings, and there's a lot in getting on board around these various things, but I just wanted to comment on a few things here. And firstly, to acknowledge that the huge importance of the chair's role. Over nearly 20 years of working full-time on board performance-related issues, there is possibly no other single ingredient that is as important as this issue of board leadership. And it's obviously more than just meeting management, but we're talking about meeting management here, and the chair's role is crucial in that regard, because the chair sets the tone and the chair guides the board through the meeting process, keeps things on track,
ensures that people feel that they are safe to contribute, and draws people out and draws issues out, synthesises the discussion, articulates the conclusion, and enables clear decisions to be recorded when it's a decision-making topic. So I can't emphasise the importance of the chair's role in meeting management and more broadly, more than that. Preparation, it behooves everyone on a board to be well prepared for meetings. Unfortunately, that's not always the case, and for most of your boards, I suspect people are doing this as a voluntary activity. They've got day jobs, they've got family commitments, etc., and often their board role comes second to those things. But really, you cannot contribute effectively to a meeting unless you're well prepared, you've read the papers, you've thought about the agenda topics. And it's actually, I think, quite disrespectful to your staff to make sweat and blood over board papers and try to anticipate questions and so forth, only to find that somebody asks a question which is answered on page 2 of the paper. So preparation is the least we should expect of people who are coming to board meetings. Starting and finishing on time, again picking up the theme of volunteers, when people are fitting their board role in around other commitments, I think it's a form of respect to them too that the board meeting starts on time, even if there's some stragglers, and it finishes on time so that people can be confident about commitments that they make beyond the board meeting. Staying on agenda. It's very easy to lose track of the substance of the agenda. One of Parkinson's laws is the law of triviality, which says that a board will spend its time on things inversely related to their importance. And I guess we can all tell war stories about situations that we've encountered where boards have got sidetracked in no time flat onto something which has got absolutely nothing to do with the substance of the meeting. I referred to flexibility there. Sometimes things come out of the blue at an organisation ahead of the meeting, and there are situations where those couldn't have been anticipated, and they're of such importance that really time needs to be found in the meeting to deal with those issues. The most extreme example I had of that was with a client in Australia. I was at their board meeting the day after the terrorists hit the World Trade Center, and this was a company that had an international intellectual property business, and they ended up on that particular day parking their whole agenda so that they could give consideration to what the implications of that event might have been for their business. It's seldom as extreme as that, but I think you can also make your agenda too much of too concrete, too inflexible. There are things that come up during the course of most board meetings that aren't related to the agenda today, but which are worth noting and hanging on to and scheduling for subsequent discussion. So that's my reference to the parking lot. A parking lot's an old facilitator's trick to keep meetings on track. It's about recognising that somebody's come up with a good idea or something that's really relevant, just not to what's on the agenda today. So don't lose track of those things. Funnily enough, I find that when you get to the end of a meeting and you say, okay, let's have a look at what's on the parking lot, some of those things have been ticked off in any case. Participation. We want all board members to be actively involved in the discussion. And of course, some people are naturally able to do that. They think quickly, they sometimes speak even more quickly, and if you're not careful, those individuals will dominate the airtime of a board meeting. So again, it's something that not only the chair has got the responsibility for, but I think other board members say, well, look, we haven't heard from Jack. What are your thoughts on this particular topic? Draw people out, and there are various techniques for doing that, which I won't go into now. But just at the end of the day, governance, the work of the board is an intellectual exercise, and we need to know what everyone's thoughts on important topics are. Closure of the meeting is important in terms of the clarity of decisions. I've seen some awful situations where board members have left a board meeting thinking that they're already clear about what's been decided, and before long it's realised that everyone's taken different interpretations from what had been the discussion and the decision that was made. So I think be really careful that everyone is clear what decision has actually been made. And in relation to that, the minutes are important as well. Obviously, the minutes record those decisions, but ideally the minutes should also record the gist of the board's thinking that has taken you to that decision as well. And I think the best test of the adequacy of minutes is, could a new board member come along in a few months' time and go back through the minutes and make sense of why the board's made a decision? So it's a constant debate about how lengthy minutes should be. They shouldn't be a transcript. It doesn't much matter what individuals have contributed to the meeting, but they should at least give a good overview of how the board has reached certain decisions, and the sort of questions that have been raised as well. I think it would be a very good exercise for everyone to read the recent Auditor General's report on the Pike River situation. You'll find that that report, which came out I think a couple of weeks ago now, demonstrates that when the Auditor General was reviewing the board's decision making around, this is really solid energy in a broader sense, I suppose. In fact, I am talking about solid energy, my apologies, I referred to Pike River. The two have subsequently become joined, but they reviewed the failures or supposed failures of solid energy. And what the report is very much about is teasing out the sort of questions, for example, that the board was asking of senior management about key investment decisions. And clearly the board of Solid Energy had been very thorough in recording the sort of topics that they discussed, the sort of questions that were raised by the board around the business cases and the risks involved. Moving on to information, which is the other key element in board meeting effectiveness. Boards can't have good meetings without good raw material, and that's where the role of staff usually becomes very important. The board is very dependent on management for the information that it needs to have a good meeting. And so it's important to prepare board papers specifically to meet the needs of the board. Recycled management reporting that's been prepared for some other purpose more often than not just invites the board to delve down into operational matters that really they haven't got time for and can't add a great deal of value to. So it's really important to be clear about the quantity of information that the board requires. And what I hear over and over again when we're conducting board effectiveness reviews is board members saying we get too much of the wrong stuff. So quantity is an issue. Also important in terms of, again, comments I was making earlier on about voluntary board members. Their preparation time is inherently limited, so you want it to be as easy as possible for them to get on top of the issues that are going to be considered at the board meeting. Quality of board papers is also very important in terms of aiding board members' understanding. Formatting, presentation, and those sorts of things cannot be underestimated. I think boards can do a lot to help staff to help them. So I'm pleased that there are staff members on this webinar call as well. I think boards need to encourage staff to be prepared to discuss matters that they're not certain of themselves yet. To share the things that they're a bit wobbly about, a bit anxious about, that they've only just started to think about. And to invite the board to contribute to framing those sorts of things. And as I say, encourage staff to bring up questions that they haven't yet got answers to. The other thing that staff have to be conscious of is that boards need to be actively involved. Too often boards find themselves just sitting passively listening to staff presentations. And that's not a great use of board meeting time, because the board members themselves need to be actively engaged in the conversation. And as I say, that final bullet point, when board members are actively involved in the discussion, they can leave the meeting knowing that they've been participants, not just passive spectators who at best might be rubber stamping staff that's pretty much completed before the board meeting. In terms of meeting process, the tone of the meeting, the way people speak to each other, the way they engage in important discussions is very important. So I've identified three things here. The last I'll expand on a wee bit in subsequent slides. The first one, I hope, is pretty self-explanatory. We need a culture of inquiry around the board table. Our board is very much involved in a continuous learning process. And it's really important that board members engage in that in the spirit of inquiry, not in the spirit of inquisition. When there's an inquisitional sort of process, that tends to close both other board members and staff down. They're not so willing to engage, they don't feel as safe in the environment, and it's not a happy place. In terms of dialogue, I'm making a contrast there between dialogue, as I'll explain a bit more in a moment, and debate. And I'm talking about debate there in the sense of a contest that somebody is trying to win. It's a sort of style of discourse you tend to see in highly politicised bodies like local authorities, for example, when there's a lot of point scoring goes on, and the debate is very much about getting in your views and browbeating other people and trying to have your point of view predominating regardless of what anyone else might say. And I'll explain learning rather than judging in terms of the types of questions that might be asked in a moment. So here's some of the features of dialogue, and I'm not going to go through that in detail. You'll have a chance to look at this material in more depth later on, but I tend to think of a good board meeting as being like putting together a jigsaw puzzle. Everyone comes to the meeting with a different piece of the puzzle in terms of different levels of understanding of issues, different levels of expertise and prior knowledge of something, different sense of what's happening in the external environment. So it's about putting those pieces together and creating a pool of shared understanding and shared meeting. And it means that we value everything that each individual brings to that board meeting. It's also about exploring together the different options that might be open. And it's a good process for preventing the board from getting into groupthink, because it's quite a rigorous process. It's not about everyone agreeing with each other or avoiding important conversations, and it's not about the sort of confrontational point scoring that I alluded to before. So it's about recognising a learning process is going on, discussing issues in a way that everyone can get on top of them and develop a shared consensus and commitment to whatever action emerges. If I can also just briefly talk about the way board members ask questions. and I think we've probably all heard the type of media inquiries. We hear journalists who ask questions in a very aggressive, judgmental sort of way, and it's like they've set themselves up as some sort of judge and jury. They've already decided in advance of the interview that they're right, and their job is to get the interview subject to admit that they've set something up. So the way you ask questions in a board environment is very much more effective if it's in that sort of learning style. And the sort of the tone that sits in behind that is, help me to understand this topic or this issue. There's some critical values I think that board should adopt in getting the tone of the meeting process right. Obviously, civility flows from what I've just been saying, courtesy and politeness. I think a willingness to take risks, creating a safe environment is very important, and the chair has a key role, but other board members as well. And to value different points of view. I've described it as an appreciation of diversity, but just recognising that sometimes those outlier ideas and the intelligent but naive questions can really take the board in a whole new and more productive direction. The new issue of getting on board has some new material in it related to board dynamics. We don't have time this morning to go into that in depth, but I'd urge you to read those sections. There's a whole bunch of things there. I've referred to the status dilemma, for example, and even if it's just because some people have been on the board longer than others, they tend to their view tends to carry more weight, or they can be more confident about things, and that can create differences within the board which need to be addressed. There's an inherent tension structurally between board and management because there's a power imbalance. The board is constitutionally more powerful, but management controls the raw material for the meeting. As I said before, they control the flow of information. So they have functional power, if you like. Board service, as many of you will have discovered, is replete with paradox. And one of the paradoxes is that we want to sustain cohesion around the board table, but we also want to encourage different points of view to be expressed and to be firmly expressed. Perhaps in the light of what I said before, I shouldn't have used the word debate here, but we do want to encourage people to think independently and to express a personal point of view. But at the same time, we don't want that to get in the way of board teamwork. And then there's the ambiguous nature of the board's role. You've all got trust deeds, and for incorporated societies, you've got rules and so forth. You've got all that constitutional stuff, but actually it doesn't tell you how the board should go about its work, and the board's got to work that out for itself, and it can be very poorly expressed. And we talked in the first webinar about the importance of board policy and board charters and the like. There's a whole bunch of material getting on board about various group pathologies that are relevant to the way boards operate, and you'll see a number of those there that may not mean much to you in terms of the way those headings are described. So again, I urge you to explore those in more depth in the Getting on Board 4th edition. But just to be conscious of those and how boards can very easily fall into decision-making traps. The bottom one, social loafing, might have jumped out at some of you, and that's really an allusion to the fact that often boards are carried in terms of their workloads and active engagement by a relatively small number of the total number of board members, and others just coast along for various reasons. So I think, again, Helen, let's pause there and just see if there are any questions in relation to any of that material.
Thanks, Graham. I should also say that the PowerPoint slides, as well as this webinar recording, will be made available after today's session. So you can revisit some of the content, particularly in this last section, which was really valuable. Thank you. Does anyone have a question for Graham? Again, you can unmute yourself by pressing *6 if you do. No? Okay, I think we might...
Hello, sorry.
Oh, great. Hi.
Hi, Richard Endo from Footnote New Zealand Dance. Apologies if this has been covered elsewhere, but given the framework that you've been talking about so far, approximately how long do you recommend for a regular board meeting?
Well, to some extent, it depends on the workload that you've defined for yourselves through that earlier agenda planning process that I've talked about. I think there are problems at both ends of the time continuum. So I think short board meetings, and when I say short, an hour, hour and a half, which is not unusual amongst voluntary boards. I think those tend to be more ticking off type board meetings, go through the agenda, try and get through it as quickly, as expeditiously as possible. But it leaves very little space for that sort of generative thinking I was referring to before. On the other hand, if you go beyond 3 to 4 hours, I think it's very difficult for most people to concentrate and stay with the discussion for longer, and I think people do tend to get very tired, particularly if the earlier discussion has been quite demanding in an intellectual sense. So I think the sweet spot is probably between 3 and 4 hours, but I find myself, the couple of boards that I chair, one's a Crown entity, and I find that we even struggle to get through the business that we do have to deal with in that amount of time. But if we went on any longer, I think the work would just expand to fill the time available.
Thank you.
Thanks, Graham. Does anyone else have a question?
Oh, hi there. Yes, it's Elise Servac here from the Basement Theatre.
Hi, Lee.
Hi. We've got a question about, it's around that relationship management side of things, and how we as a management team kind of negotiate relationships with patrons and funders, or quite active patrons who are kind of building relationships with our board as well as us, and working with us on day-to-day kind of fundraising activities, but also having a different line of communication with the board. And we're finding that sometimes you can get, with having those two lines of communication, it can be quite hard to manage, and mixed messages come through. So what's the best way to deal with that?
That's one of the perennial problems, I'm afraid, because some of those stakeholders do expect to have a direct relationship with the board, but at the same time there's a working or business relationship which operates at a staff level as well. I think the risks have to be managed on both sides, both at the staff and the board level, and that's principally by keeping each other informed about conversations that you've had or plan to have, so that you can be coordinated in your approach. I think it's really important at the board level too that individual board members aren't engaging and giving different messages to the same stakeholder group. And so I think it's very important there that there's some sort of coordination process, and that probably the best way to do that is through the chair. And some boards are even quite strict in terms of the way they try and manage those relationships, so that there is only one point of contact which is approved, and only one sort of single authoritative spokesperson for either the organisation or for a particular issue.
Yeah, that's what we've been thinking, that we need to streamline that communication. Is that best to come through the management team or through the board, or is it just a manifest decision between us?
Look, I think that from a staff perspective, you've got to manage the risk of your board. Yeah. And I say that very respectfully, because they're out there networking, and one of the reasons they're on the board is because of their networks in some cases. Yeah. So it's really just about making sure that you're all on the same page, And there's a section in Getting on Board about stakeholder management, and there's a tool in there that I think is really about developing a stakeholder strategy, and I think that's something that board members and senior staff should do together so that they have a shared understanding of the stakeholder environment.
Okay, great. Yeah, I'll definitely look that up. Thanks so much.
Thanks.
Helen, I see that there's a written question there from Mark Williams about the best number of board members. I'd just say very quickly in response to that, the various social science research into group dynamics and so forth says that the sweet spot for any decision-making groups around 7 or 8 people. And I certainly get very cautious about going above that number.
Great, thank you. That must have been sent to you privately.
Yes, perhaps it was, yeah.
Yeah, fantastic. So I think we'll move on now to the third and final section. Yeah, so thanks, Graham.
Okay, so we're now going to just talk briefly, and it will be briefly, about nurturing the board-executive relationship. And your first slide, I just want to acknowledge that it's actually a very challenging relationship, and it was once described by one writer as a bit like dancing a tango. And I think that's quite a nice sort of metaphor for this, because you know, if you would think back to that TV program that some of us used to watch called Dancing with the Stars, you know, it was pretty obvious when the amateur and the professional were out of step. In one case, I remember a very prominent politician dropping his professional dance partner on her head. And I guess that's the lesson from this, that if either the board or its executive team are out of step, they're both in a big heap on the floor. And so it's really important to think through what are the steps, how do they link together, are we dancing to the same music and to the same tempo, etc., etc. You can draw a lot out of that thought. And here's just sort of a lighter comment that I wanted to make, and it alludes a wee bit to the comments I made before about board meetings. But said here, you know, board members come to meetings for 2 objectives. Firstly, to be useful, to add value to the organisation, and obviously as volunteers, they don't want to come and be bored. But you know, senior staff come to board meetings with 2 objectives too, and I've been on both sides of this, and I know that they're true. But these 2 objectives are in direct conflict with the board members' objectives, and that is, staff want to demonstrate they've already thought of everything, they've got everything under control, and there's nothing for the board to worry about. And they also want to demonstrate at great length how much they know and how well on top of things they actually are. And if that happens, it really excludes the board from participation. So just bear that in mind. So I wanted to just make what is perhaps a very basic point, and that is, and if you go back to your trust deeds or your rules or other constitutional documents, the only reference you'll find to a chief executive or an executive director's role is something which is very permissive, and it just says, you know, that the board may employ staff, because constitutionally it's the board's job to manage the organisation. And this is also true for those of you who've got private sector directorships. You know, the Companies Act says exactly the same thing. It's the board's job to manage the organisation. But of course it has to do that by delegation, because the board's only part-time. It can only be involved in you know, relatively small proportion of the activities of the organisation. And it should do that selectively, and it should really delegate the authority that resides with the board to other people to get on with the job. Now, the board can do that quite explicitly by explicit delegation, or it can do it by neglecting to do that and effectively doing it by default. And I've had boards say to me, oh, we don't need all that delegation stuff, and we don't need board charters and all the rest of it, because we've got a good chief executive and she knows what she's doing, we just let her get on with the job. Well, that's okay, up to a point, but it'll all end in tears eventually, I can assure you. So it's really about saying that the chief executive's job doesn't exist except in relation to authority which is delegated by the board. And it also means that the chief executive's job is sequential to that of the board, and it means that the board must do its own job first. So I think boards need to continually remind themselves of that, the chief executive and the staff work within a framework which is created by the board. So I'd refer you back to the first webinar where we talked at length about the board's policy-making role. And it's about the board being really clear about what its expectations of management actually are. There's different ways of doing this, of course, and the material that's included in getting on board refers to really two sides of the same coin, delegation coin. And that's about the board needing to be really clear about what the organisation should achieve. And that's often expressed in the form of a strategic plan or some similar document. And that should be expressed prescriptively. It should be expressed in a positive tone. Ideally, it should be expressed in terms of outcomes to be achieved or results to be achieved. But the other side of the coin is also the risk management side, and boards are ultimately responsible for making sure that no harm befalls their organisation. So it's also about thinking through what is it that we have to avoid. Now, the best way to express that sort of stuff is not prescriptively, but proscriptively. Express it in terms of restrictions. And that results in some of the language that you'll see in some of the policy examples in getting on board, which are expressed I often think of them as the thou shalt not stuff. And another way of looking at that, I try and express it in this diagram here, it's really about the board saying that it's really important that we achieve certain results, but those results or those ends don't justify the means. Any old means are not acceptable. Some means, some ways of achieving those results are acceptable to the board, and for various reasons others will not be acceptable. And again, it's something that the board has to do, is to think through where those boundaries might lie, and then delegate to the chief executive the freedom. They're empowered to operate within those boundaries. But if they want to go outside those boundaries, then they need to go back to the board and, in effect, ask for permission. So those are what are described as unacceptable means, unless the board has a chance to consider them and approve them. And a really simple example, which I think most boards and most staffs are familiar with, is a financial delegation, which says that the chief executive may not spend or commit funds in excess of a certain defined amount. That's a way of the board controlling the financial risk, but that whole concept can be applied much more broadly and is a very, very powerful tool. But it does mean that boards and staff have to get past their intuitive sense that everything should be expressed in a positive sense rather than in a negative sense. But I would urge you to resist that temptation to rewrite the prescriptive policies that examples of are included in getting on board and put up with what is often quite awkward language, double negatives and the like. But it is a very powerful, and this is counterintuitive, it's a very powerful empowerment tool for your staff, because the board is saying, provided you stay within these boundaries, we will live with your judgment on those things. But we reserve the right to make decisions on things which are outside those boundaries. So I'm going to finish at this point. Helen, I'll just note again the getting on board, and also let you know that we publish a regular online publication. It's free. Subscriptions can be obtained off our website, boardworksinternational.com. It's got a bit clipped on my slide. And you're welcome to sign up for regular articles on the sort of topics that we've been talking about this morning.
Thanks very much, Graham. We do have a question from Amy Mansfield from Storylines, and she would like to know, what do you think is an average ideal term for board members to serve? and also what key professional skills do most boards need to have?
Okay, well, just a very quick answer to the first part of that. I've been involved in a fairly extensive debate internationally with a community of governance practitioners over the last few months, and I think that to be effective on a board, you've got to be there for at least 3 years. We've done quite a bit of research in different sectors, including when we were developing the first version of Getting on Board. At that time, board members in the arts and cultural sector typically said it took them about 2 years to get on top of the job, and we've found that is the same in other sectors as well. So we want people to serve beyond those initial couple of years. How long is a matter of more debate at the upper end. I know that in my personal situation, I find that after about 6 or 7 years on the same board, I'm pretty much, I've contributed what I'm capable of contributing to that board. I think people would stay on boards for longer than that, but I think that there should be a policy on an upper limit, a maximum tenure, and for me it's probably about 8 or 9 years. The second part of the question, what professional skills do most boards need to have? I think it depends on the size of the organisation and the depth of its staffing resource. You know, really small organisations tend to populate their boards with professional skills like financial skills, accounting, so forth, and with legal skills. I think that's probably okay when organisations are really small, because that's a way of bringing those perspectives that aren't present amongst the staff. But when organisations are big enough to employ their own finance staff and to pay for professional legal advice, I think they need to look more broadly. And the skills needed should be driven by the strategic challenges facing the organisation. You know, what perspectives do you need around the table? Bearing in mind, at the end of the day, it's not the board's job to do staff work. If they do staff work, it's under a separate hat as volunteers.
Thanks, Graham. And just finally, because we're now out of time, Mark Williams from Circuit has another question, and he wants to know how many board meetings is best per annum?
I think it's a balance between continuity and the workload, and I'm not convinced that boards need to meet every month. I've personally found, both as a board member and as a chief executive, that a 6-weekly cycle works pretty well. You know, I think it does come back to planning workload, the amount of time people have got to devote to the challenges facing the organisation.
Great, thanks very much. So I just want to remind people that the recording will be available in about a week, and we'll email you all when it's on our website. If you do have any further questions, observations or feedback, we'd love to hear from you. Do email me or Cassandra, and we can also forward any questions on to Graham. I'd like to especially thank you, Graham, for today's session. It was incredibly insightful, highly practical and very informative. So really fantastic, and thank you very much. And thanks to everyone for joining us. Bye for now.
Goodbye.